Welcome to the Indian Ocean World podcast.
Hello, and welcome to the Indian Ocean World podcast. My name is Philip Gooding. I'm a postdoctoral fellow at the Indian Ocean World Centre at McGill University. In this podcast, I am joined by Professor Rosabelle Boswell, who is a professor of anthropology at Nelson Mandela Metropolitan University in Port Elizabeth, South Africa. Professor Boswell is a feminist. She is passionate about human diversity, social justice, and gender equality. She has conducted research on racism, heritage, tourism, and gender in Mauritius, Madagascar, Seychelles, Zanzibar, and South Africa. She is the author of several peer-reviewed articles and books, including recently a co-edited volume with Francis Nyamjo entitled Post-Colonial African Anthropologies, which is published by the Human Sciences Research Council Press in South Africa. She is currently involved in research with a UKRI-funded project entitled One Ocean Hub, which is led by Strathclyde University in Scotland, which explores ocean sustainability and oceans governance. Professor Boswell, thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much for inviting me.
In this podcast, Professor Boswell will discuss with us her recent appointment at the South African Research Chair in Ocean, Cultures and Heritage, an exciting, newly created position which touches on many themes about the study of the Indian Ocean world in the social sciences and humanities, past and present. Thus, Professor Boswell, would you mind telling us what are the origins of this research chair? What are you hoping to achieve personally in this position, but also more widely, think about the scholarly field of research into ocean cultures and heritage?
Thank you very much, Philip, if I may call you Philip. Well, the research basically has quite deep roots. It started way back in 2003 when I was working as an ordinary professor of anthropology at Rhodes University, and I undertook a preliminary field research visit to Zanzibar. And it was there that I realized that there were so many potential linkages with the work that I had already started in Mauritius for the doctoral program. And I felt it would be interesting to pursue a comparative, analysis of African diaspora identity and ocean cultures in the two islands. And it was from that space that the field research grew, because subsequent to that, I also had the opportunity to visit the Seychelles, and I also had the opportunity to go to Madagascar to do further comparative work. And that early work was funded by the Netherlands Foundation for the Advancement of Tropical Research, and I suppose without them, I would not have been able to conduct. Without their funding support, I would not have been able to conduct that research. But it yielded some very, very interesting sort of findings around what I would call intangible cultural heritage, or the non-tangible heritages of the world. So essentially your folk songs, ritual practices, beliefs, and especially gendered ideas about being in the world. Because my work in Zanzibar was predominantly with women and families, and that yielded very rich data on the lives of women and their potential and their contribution to the intangible cultural heritage of Tanzania. Subsequent to that, I'm not going to go into too much detail here, but subsequent to that, I conducted similar research in Seychelles. And in Seychelles, I was fortunate enough to be able to speak the lingua franca Creole, being somebody from Mauritius by birth. And so I was able to understand the language. So that provided, again, a sort of deeper understanding of the intangible heritages of the Seychelles, especially Mahe, the main island of the Seychelles. And I did similar work in Madagascar. That was shortly after there was a there was a coup, there was a military coup in Madagascar in 2009, and I arrived there shortly thereafter. I did 2 stints of fieldwork there. The first part in the northern part of Madagascar, and islands off the northeast coast. And then the second part of the research was done in Antananarivo itself. So yes, it was basically this kind of rich, context that yielded, some of the insights that came to be reflected in the Saatchi chair proposal, or the research chair proposal. In terms of what the chair seeks to achieve, very briefly, the purpose is to investigate, to report on, debate, and engage, as well as to advance knowledge regarding the intangible cultural heritages of people who live in the coastal areas of several African countries. My previous work, as I have already indicated, the previous work focused quite strictly or quite narrowly on the sort of Indian Ocean islands, Southwest Indian Ocean islands. And the work that I'm proposing to do now is going to engage a more sub-Saharan African perspective, because it's going to look at the situation in coastal communities in Namibia, in South Africa, Mozambique, Kenya, and Tanzania. So again, we will be doing more in-depth work on hopefully on Zanzibar and the East African littoral. The deeper purpose of this is not just to reveal, knowledge that perhaps has been marginalized or not fully understood or not fully documented. The aim is to also provide a sort of new archive, or an archive rather, to advance a sort of new African epistemologies. You may recall that about maybe 15 or so years ago in South Africa, we had this space, or this movement called the African Renaissance Program. And the aim of it was to bring to the fore those knowledges that had been set to the margins under both slavery and colonial rule. And an important part, therefore, of the research chair project is to excavate these knowledge forms, which may ultimately, benefit the sub-Saharan population and the world at large, because it's knowledge that for a long time has been kept under wraps, or not fully well known. The other part of the research is to also to document some of the socioeconomic inequalities emerging as a result of continued the imposition of neoliberal forces. So, for instance, one of the things that was noted in the sort of earlier field work in Tanzania and in Madagascar was the extent to which new investors were coming in and seeing that some of these countries are less developed countries or quite poor countries, were bringing in forms of infrastructural development, port development, and so on, that was not necessarily beneficial to local communities. And so part of this work is to also engage with these potentially problematic development initiatives, and to find ways of empowering local communities to ensure that their knowledge is more widely shared. In broader policy terms, sort of beyond fieldwork and beyond local community empowerment and support, the research also seeks to give meaning to and to deepen UNESCO's bid to more fully document the intangible cultural heritages of the world. At the moment, we have more than 900 World Heritage Sites listed on the WHL, and more money is actually invested and more time and energy is given by national governments to the conservation and the management of tangible heritages, your sites, your monuments, artifacts, and so on. But if we consider what is being done for the oral and intangible cultural heritages, especially of African heritage, we see that there isn't much that is basically noted, on the World Heritage List. And so an important contribution, of this project will be to hopefully again excavate or unearth those intangible heritages that are potentially of world heritage value, so that they may potentially be nominated and inscribed on the list of oral and intangible cultural heritages. A further aim, broader aim of the project is to engage with what the One Ocean Hub calls transformative oceans governance. So that's a really important aspect, of the Saatchi Chair project, because presently we have a situation where many coastal communities, especially those people who belong to indigenous or autochthonous groups, that are in fact, again, very much left on the margins of decision-making processes, or there is insufficient legal framework or laws to support their participation in oceans management and in oceans governance. So an important aspect of the project is to foreground the importance of community participation in the oceans governance process, to advance indigenous ways or autochthonous ways of knowing and being with the sea. So we have quite, I think at the moment, fairly dominant sort of Western paradigms and ways of framing the sea and engaging the sea and managing the sea and legislating the sea. And an important part of this project would be to foreground alternative ways of seeing and being with the ocean, so that we can also have different valuations of the ocean, because the current valuation that we're seeing is one that is focused quite strongly on the sort of the economic contributions that the ocean can make to the global economy. And there are not many social science, cultural perspectives on what contributions the ocean can make to humanity other than the economic.
That's wonderful. Thank you very much for that summary, Professor Boswell. This sounds like an absolutely fascinating project, a fascinating position, and one which I'm really excited to see develop further. One of the things that's really exciting about it is clearly that I think it's quite novel from a social sciences and humanities perspective. But of course, at the same time, we can say that natural scientists have been engaging with oceans and oceanic spaces for decades. I wondered, what do you attribute the relative slowness of social sciences and humanities to kind of engage with the ocean in the way that you're doing now? Yeah. And in what ways are you interacting with, I suppose, natural science perspectives?
Yeah, thanks for that. I think, one could speculate as to why, why social scientists haven't really engaged sort of more deeply in this field up to this point. I think part of it has to do with the sort of global valuation of social science and humanities knowledge, that the idea that what social scientists and in particular anthropologists have to contribute is very much limited to the sort of field context, to the this research site in which they do their field research, not understanding, of course, that the discipline of anthropology has, especially globally, that it has wider applications. In the context of South Africa, especially, if we look at the development of the discipline of anthropology, the sort of at least national perception has been that we tend to produce a knowledge that is locally embedded within a particular field site. It's time bound, and it may not have, wider meaning or potential application beyond that space. I do also feel that funding patterns have also impacted the collaboration process. So until very recently, especially in sub-Saharan Africa, until very recently, there was not much in the way of focus on the transdisciplinary research potential. The emphasis was on, achieving outcomes from pure natural science, marine spatial planning, for example, or, bioecological assessments, and not taking into account the importance perhaps of local communities and their perspectives and their experiences and their potential contributions to debates around marine spatial planning. And this was especially, I think, problematic in a place like South Africa, given its history of, the sort of both slavery, colonialism, and then, of course, apartheid, systems that excluded local communities in order for the unequal political system to flourish. And so it's quite, I think there are significant changes that have occurred since 1994 with the advent of democracy, especially in South Africa, and the recognition that community participation is key, that indigenous knowledge systems are important, that we need to take these into account when implementing any form of development project, whether it's at the coast or further inland. I also feel that, to go back to the question of why social scientists have not more directly engaged natural scientists, I also think that there was a sort of a disciplinary sort of, divide as well, and a sort of mistrust of natural scientists, especially in South Africa. The idea that, the social scientists were more in tune with the political climate of the country, that they were more aligned to achieving, sort of democratic outcomes, whereas the scientists were in it really just for the science, which, of course, is a legitimate thing for them to do, but at the same time, the potential there for it to actually ignore the inequalities and exclusions which were continuing in the South African context. Now, I don't know if you asked me the question of why have I gone the route of seeking to work more closely with natural scientists or not. Did you ask me that? Sorry,
I don't think I did directly, but by all means, it's an interesting question to answer. So if you have some insights, gladly.
Yeah, so in my previous work in education management as a dean, I worked with a number of different colleagues, in different disciplines. And there I saw, the potential for actually working across these different boundaries. So like most academics, I had my own sort of disciplinary home. And when I was a full-time professor, that was, I was embedded in that particular space, and I didn't really encounter or see the possibility for transdisciplinary work. But it became very clear, as, I did more and more research, especially in the Indian Ocean region, it became very clear that the issues of environment and community and the issues of, culture and tourism, that these are interlinked and to a certain extent interdependent. And that if I really wanted to understand, community participation in a coastal setting, I needed to engage with marine spatial planners, and I needed to engage with other natural scientists working in this field. It was not something that I could ignore, and I've learned a great deal actually. That the possibilities for collaboration are there, and that we as social scientists also have to be quite confident about the contributions that we bring from our respective disciplines, as well as to be confident also about the methodologies that we have been educated in. Yeah.
Wonderful. I just want to pick up one of the threads you mentioned about South Africa as a nation state and the changes that have occurred since 1994, and how your work is kind of situated within that. Of course, since the mineral revolution in the late 19th century, South Africa's centres have been traditionally been viewed economically and politically, I suppose, present-day Gauteng, basically in the interior, the terrestrial interior of South Africa. I was wondering, how does your work, I suppose, reorient this thinking about Africa's past and present, and particularly its place in the modern world, by taking, I suppose, this oceanic perspective?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I mean, I think that in one line, it seeks to present Africa as a noble and meaningful contributor to world knowledge forms. I think that is what I would say, because for far too long, I think that the knowledges held here, which are diversely influenced, whether people from the Middle East that, came into sort of northern parts of Africa, et cetera, the archaeology of Africa is actually showing that we have these diverse cultural origins. And we, for the last, 500 years, really, we haven't seized the opportunity. We have not seized that opportunity to make the knowledges of Africa known more widely and to be respected more widely. Yeah.
That's fantastic. Then in that case, I've got a kind of a question about the methodologies. And actually, I'm going to ask you questions about your research more broadly. In preparing for this podcast, I really, really enjoyed reading your articles on voicescapes in the study of Sega as voice work, and also about stories of sensuousness in the Indian Ocean Islands. I wonder if you could talk about the methodologies of acquiring these intangible knowledges in these oceanic spaces. And the ones that you've employed innovatively, and how this can contribute to an understanding of African knowledges in oceanic spaces.
Yeah, I recently read this book by an author called, I think his name is François Laplantine. He wrote this book on the senses and the importance of the senses to research. And he employed the term participant sensation. And it struck me that this was something that, that I had been doing, without sort of not consciously knowing or, realizing that I wasn't really doing participant observation in the sort of classic sense of the term, as we say in anthropology, where you go out and you spend a great deal of time in the local community and you observe. So you maintain a measure of objectivity through your own culturally influenced lenses. You observe what is going on in the community, and then you seek to document that as faithfully as you can. And later on, you sort of scrutinize those observations to ensure that you haven't misrepresented the community, or that your biases have not necessarily crept in. But one of the things that I eventually came to me in the course of field research in the Indian Ocean region over many years was that as a researcher, it's very difficult to, first of all, remain completely objective. And it's not because of one's subjectivity. It's not because of necessarily because of where we come from, and what cultural influences have, impacted on us as individuals growing up in a particular cultural milieu. It's not that. It's because we are profoundly sensory beings. And in the days gone by, when people spoke about culture shock wasn't always or necessarily about a sort of cognitive, sort of cognitively detached process that is happening to the individual, but rather a sort of sensory dislocation that was happening to them because they were no longer in an environment where the sensory environment was one that they had grown to sort of be accustomed to and were comfortable with. And especially as a gendered, as a woman doing field research in mostly patriarchal societies, the experience of participant sensation was even, heightened to a greater extent because I was no longer in a space where I was surrounded potentially by family members that could ostensibly protect me, this idea that as a woman, you're vulnerable and you need to be protected all the time. And I had to, physically and in sensory terms, I had to come to grips literally with, being in a space where I am, I'm completely open and vulnerable to the multiple sensory, experiences that are happening in a space. And so, just to give you an example, I mean, in the paper on sensuous stories, I talk about how the participants or the interviewees, in the research process, how they literally held on to me, and how their words created particular feelings or sensory experiences. And that those then became important ways for me to understand not only my personal experiences, but some of the emotions and needs and imperatives of the people living, in those areas. That was especially the case of Indian Ocean field research, especially in the work that I did in the Seychelles, where I tell this very, important story about how, the weight of the past is still manifesting in this imagery of the people carrying the breadfruit up and down, this mountain, the heaviness and the drudgery of eating only breadfruit and having only breadfruit. Very difficult to convey the multiplicity of feelings engendered in that space. But at the same time, it was powerful, because I was no longer just telling the story. I was no longer just this observer looking through the church window at the rain coming down and saying that, I see people going up and down. No, this image was, it was resplendent with this idea of the weight of the past, which is a term that, Michael Lambeck, used quite a lot in his work.
So, but of course, it's not just the image; it's the experience as well that you're trying to have recognized here. And I wondered, could you speak to the challenges of getting these kinds of forms of heritage, this intangible heritage, recognized more widely as a form of heritage with, for example, UNESCO?
Yeah, I mean, So, for example, a paper that I wrote in 2008 on sense of identity, on the scent heritage of Zanzibar, and just how fascinating that was, because it wasn't tangible. It had an element of tangibility, and it had a strong element of intangibility in terms of the beliefs and so on that were engendered as a result of particular scents that were used, particular products that produced certain emotional and psychological states. The challenge is that the nominations process with UNESCO, it's an important and it's a reasonable process, but I imagine that it could be a better process, because at the moment there's strong reliance on provincial and national UNESCO sort of entities to assist national government in the identification, in the nomination, and finally in sort of the discussions around the inscription of these heritages on the World Heritage Site. There's a very strong hierarchical structure that is not necessarily strongly linked to local communities. So if you have local community leaders or individuals, for example, that may wish to share a culture that could be of both national and world significance, they would have to go through this almost, regime process of getting that heritage documented and so on and so forth. The other challenge, of course, is whether or not they would want to have it done that way. So a big problem with intangible heritage is that if one seeks to have it conserved on the list of oral and intangible cultural heritage, the question is it then still meaningful to the local community? Has that particular cultural product, has it been ossified, or is it, will it be ossified by the process of nomination, or the version of that intangible heritage which has been captured, is it the version, or are there multiple versions? Because in essence, intangible heritage is quite dynamic. Stories, for example, that are passed on from one generation to the next, sometimes they're adapted to reflect local circumstances and imperatives. even though the style of the storytelling and its key elements remain the same. So there are big questions around whether, one can or should conserve oral intangible heritages. How do we maintain their dynamic nature? And then there's the problem of the institutional structure, the nominations and inscription process. And then also the idea that the problem or the challenge of nominating heritages that sit across regional boundaries or cultures. So in the sense of the scent heritage, for instance, is something that, it's along the East African coast. We also see it in the communities that came to Tanzania, to Zanzibar from Oman, for example. Though the scent heritage is very powerful there. It's a very important part of religious belief. Yeah.
Wonderful. That is absolutely fascinating. If you'll permit me, I will just finish with one final question on a related topic, but somewhat distinct as well. And this, I suppose, comes back to some of our focuses at the Indian Ocean World Centre. And I wondered how the urgency of climate change and to the rising global seawaters, does this in any way influence the urgency of your position? Or I suppose, in other words, how does the research chair in oceanic cultures and heritage interact with concerns about global warming and rising seawaters?
Yeah, no, that's a powerful question. I think when I reflect on this issue, what comes to mind for me is the fact that it's not just a question of saying to people that they need to move, from areas that are, within the sort of high, within the distance of the sort of high water mark, that they need to move from floodplains, or they need to leave the island of Kiribati because it's going down. It's not that, because people have very deep roots and sense of belonging to particular areas. Those histories have evolved over thousands of years. To force people to leave, certain areas, that's not the solution. But at the same time, we have the problem of rapid climate change and rapid sea level rise. So it's clear that, that much more has to be done, at the sort of at the global level. Just a couple of days ago, we were in discussions with colleagues from the One Ocean Hub around COP26 or COP26, which is the Global Climate Change Conference. And, looking at some of the, agreements, the international agreements that had been struck, in years gone by, reporting, for example, on carbon emissions, et cetera, et cetera. But a big question that we have not really yet answered is, what are we going to do with the 600 million or so people that currently live at the coast? Where are these people going to go? And even in terms of the sheer logistics of, of steadily moving people inland, and what the impact of this en masse inland migration could potentially have, on fast dwindling resources of, fresh water and food and so on. These are, I think, some of the issues that really need to be discussed. I was astonished when I learned that there are, in fact, nearly a billion people living on the world's coastlines. We're not just even talking about people who classify themselves as indigenous or autochthonous people, or people who have a culturally, distinctive, social structure that needs to be preserved, for posterity. It's not that. It's people that are living, at the coast, whose livelihoods are threatened, and whose history and culture are actually threatened too. There are really very tough decisions to be made. And I think that it's it really is going to be very difficult, because I'm not sure that we actually have enough time in which to make such important decisions, or whether the important decisions that we make are actually going to have that much effect. It's a bit pessimistic, I know, but barring some major technological sort of innovation that helps us to manage this looming crisis, I'm not sure how a global climate change conference is going to stop the tide.
Thank you very much, Professor Boswell. I'm very sorry to have led you down a somber route for the final question, but I think you're right to be pessimistic.
So just before you go, Rose, I'd like to know a bit more about your current projects. I've heard through the grapevine something about your project Blue Heritages, Ocean Cultures and Histories, and I'd just like you to speak to that maybe a tiny bit before we let you go.
Thank you very much. It's a book called Blue Heritages, Ocean Cultures and Histories in a Global Perspective, together with colleagues from the Max Planck Institute in Germany. It's David O'Kane, Jeremy Hill from University of South Pacific, and John Ansah from Cape Coast, Ghana. And it has been accepted for publication by Palgrave Macmillan. It's an edited book, so we'll be looking at submissions across the range of some of the issues that we've been talking about today: the history of ocean cultures in sub-Saharan Africa and Indian Ocean world, issues of ocean sustainability and oceans governance. So if there are people who are interested in submitting a potential chapter, they should get in touch with me.
Wow, thank you so much, Rose. And to all of our listeners, you can find Rose's information and more about Rose's research in the bio of this podcast, either on our Appraising Risk website or on our Spotify. So back to you, Nod, just to conclude.
Thank you very much, Professor Boswell. But again, thank you very much for discussing your research. It's a very exciting position. I can't wait to hear more about it as it becomes more established. Thank you also to Renée Manderville, who's been working in the background, making sure that this podcast runs without a hitch. And thank you also to the listeners for downloading. And once again, my name is Philip Gooding, and you've been listening to the Indian Ocean World podcast.
The Indian Ocean World podcast would like to acknowledge the generous support of the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada. This podcast series is part of the SSHRC-funded partnership project Appraising Risk, Past and Present, interrogating historical data to enhance understanding of environmental crises in the Indian Ocean world.